Hello world, you are listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It is Tuesday, March 3rd, 2015, episode 6. I'm your host, John Bruni, and with me in the studio today is co-host and Sage International Associate David Olney from the University of Adelaide and Alicia Moraw, Strategikon producer. Good evening to you both.
Good evening, John.
Alicia, what do we see in the news today?
Well, John, Hillary Clinton may have broken federal record-keeping laws, according to the New York Times. In Washington, former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton may have violated federal record laws by using a personal email account for all her work messages, the New York Times reported on Monday. China is to hold a parade, invite leaders to mark World War II anniversary. In Beijing, China will hold a military parade this year to mark the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II and invite the leaders of major countries involved in the war to attend, the Foreign Ministry said. Events probably aimed at Japan. Exclusive. Obama hopes for U.S. Embassy in Cuba before April summit in Panama. Washington, U.S. President Barack Obama said on Monday he hopes the United States will open an embassy in Cuba by the time of a Western Hemisphere summit in Panama in mid-April. Exclusive. Obama says Iran must halt key nuclear work for at least a decade. Washington. Iran must commit to a verifiable freeze of at least 10 years on sensitive nuclear activity for a landmark atomic deal to be reached, but the odds are still against sealing a final agreement, US President Barack Obama told Reuters on Monday. Obama. Israel's Netanyahu clash over Iran diplomacy. Washington. President Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu clashed over Iran nuclear diplomacy on Monday on the eve of the Israeli Prime Minister's hotly disputed address to Congress, underscoring the severity of US-Israeli strains over the issue. And finally, US spy chief says he got a mixed reception in North Korea. Washington. U.S. spy chief James Clapper said that when he made a secret visit to North Korea in November to bring home 2 jailed Americans, he was first given a 12-course banquet and then later told by his hosts that his security could not be guaranteed.
That'll give you heartburn, wouldn't it?
It would give you a little bit.
I was going to say, is that the meal or the place?
Well, I'm not so sure. Have we seen any really very good North Korean cuisine books out in the market?
Best thing I saw was a golf course where they were growing carp in the pond and goats on the greens. So it could have been a lovely meal of carp and ninth hole goat.
Ninth hole goat. Yes, well, anyway. Well, you know, it's actually quite an interesting little bit of grab of news there. I mean, Hillary Clinton violating laws in the United States?
Does anyone remember when President Obama wanted his BlackBerry and they had to work out how to build Uber BlackBerry to make it secure? And then in the cabinet that had to wrestle with that, they allowed a Secretary of State to break very basic security protocols when they rebuilt a piece of technology so the president could meet all the security protocols? How does this happen in a country as paranoid and over-secured as the United States?
Man, that's a good question. No idea. But the one thing that I really am quite looking forward to is this huge World War II celebration that China is going to be staging. Dave, I mean, what do you think about the idea of sending kind of messages out into, you know, the other side of the Pacific to the Japanese, for instance? Do you think they're going to pay that much attention to what's going on, or do you think it's going to be water off a duck's back?
I don't know. Japan might look at it and go, lots of kit, we need more kit. But it's more the small neighbours for whom it's going to be terrifying. What does a militarising, more and more nationalistic China want to do in the region? It's idea, we don't interfere with people. We don't interfere with countries. Well, really? If you have a massive parade to celebrate the end of the war that is more about your current status, then, wow, look what we've done since the damage that World War II caused us. Something seems a bit wrong.
It's interesting. I was reading an article today that suggested it was actually something formulated out of a RAND report on China's military capacity. I tend to agree with a lot of the points. You know, it basically went along the lines of China would have difficulty defending itself or actually attacking another first world state because of the following reasons. And they went through various points about the efficacy of Chinese military governance, lack of unity of command, a number of different generations of weapons within units, some critical issues that I think that tends to get forgotten when we talk about China being a big power and being a scary power. Because being scary means you've got the ability to actually project power into your neighborhood. And from this particular RAND report, the summary goes, it does seem to appear that China does have some extraordinary limitations on its ability to actually enforce its worldview.
I'm inclined to believe that they can send a fleet out into the world and they can be intimidating for about a week or the first 3 hours of a battle. But that's probably the sum total from what I can work out from the RAND report and some of the other stuff that's come out lately. One of the other interesting things that came out a couple of weeks ago was a summary of the development of Chinese special forces. And if that's anything to go by, they've recognised the significance of investing in the best and brightest. And at the moment, they look like everyone else's conventional infantry. So if that is an indication that that's a leap forward, then yes, quite possibly they've leapt forward dramatically from being a large and more or less dysfunctional military into being a large and somewhat functional military in the way we may have understood functional in the 1970s. But it's no real surprise that their principal point of interest is cyber warfare, because that's somewhere where they're getting into the game at the same time as everyone else.
Isn't that also where they have more unity of command? I mean, one of the things that really came from the RAND report was that the Chinese military is very much run along Soviet lines, where you have political officers who can countermand tactical officers. So if you've got a shooting match somewhere and your political officer holds trump over your military officer, you can end up having a lot of strife because the political officer will say to the soldiers, hold line, whereas the tactical officers will say, retreat, fall back, and then regroup and go after the guys, So you're going to end up having all these kind of cross currents, aren't you?
It seems that it is only in cyber command that there is a continuity between political will and military tactics, because cyber warfare is predominantly political warfare. It's terrorism without the bomb. So it seems the only area where that political model of command has any chance of working, which perhaps explains why Russia is now so good at dirty tricks. Because the old model, in a sense, is good for the new world of information control, information disruption, and having an influence over technological information environments. So China's got one big advantage there. And I guess it depends how much you can leverage that advantage in a world where other people would rather use kinetics to demonstrate that the regime really doesn't have, military power in the conventional sense.
So, dominating the headlines this week was the stability of the Abbott government. After weeks of speculation as to whether or not Prime Minister Abbott would remain in his position or be replaced by the silent candidate Malcolm Turnbull, rumours of Abbott's demise have been put to rest for now. But will a bounce in the polls be enough to save the Liberal leader? Or is this a short respite before the knives come out again? And if the Abbott Prime Ministership ends, what does this mean for opposition leader Bill Shorten?
I don't know about this story. I think it's really a case of we just have to wait and see. Although the money seems to be that there will eventually be a leadership spill. It's a matter of really when. Is it going to be before the May budget? Will it be after the May budget? I tend to suggest that the Liberal Party does not want to go down the Labor Party track because it just has a lot of bad karma there. So they don't want to actually go out of their way to make a political bloodbath and execute their Prime Minister. What they'll try to do is they'll probably use the Anzac Centenary as a way in which they can gently ease Abbott into a kind of retirement. So by the time the budget comes, if the budget seems to be a good budget and wins the Liberal Party votes, he may actually stay in and deliver that budget and then be suggested to resign. But again, the political situation is rather fluid. Well, what are your thoughts, Dave?
I think I agree that if the budget is acceptable to the majority of Australians, that it's not the disaster of last year's budget that offended essentially everybody, there's a chance that he gets another year. But in reality, it seems that the party is rattled enough to believe they can't go to the next federal election with him as leader because of the sheer number of gaffes. And the fact that every time things get difficult, he focuses on security or something international, which then leads to the next gaffe.
Mm.
So there's just a pattern here that it seems highly unlikely that the pattern can be undone. So it's really a matter of time before the silent candidate or the candidate in the shadows becomes the candidate in the open, or we get something really, really interesting of Julie Bishop being the person who stands to be Prime Minister.
Just about to raise her name. You know, there was a really interesting piece in today's Sydney Morning Herald which suggested, it was written by Peter Reith, former Liberal Party Treasurer, and essentially he suggested that we are tending to overlook the fact that Julie Bishop still might be a very good candidate in terms of leadership prospects. And if you're looking at the Liberal Party in terms of the two factions, the wets and the dries, the wets being more sort of left of centre and the dries being more right of centre, then the right of centre candidates would galvanise, or the right of centre of the party would galvanise more around a Julie Bishop type of figure as opposed to a Malcolm Turnbull.
Malcolm Turnbull's just too divisive for most of the party.
Mm.
Whereas Julie Bishop, everyone could accept it if that's what it takes to stay in power. And I think we need to keep in mind, this is a political party that at present is showing no signs of having an ideology that can explain or deal with the year 2015. It's stuck in some sort of residual, Thatcherite, Reaganist, Howardian misery.
Howardian?
Yeah, it's the only word I can think of. And Howardian seems appropriate. It sounds like an era that should have been 100 years ago.
Yes. Well, you look, Howardian though it might be, how do you think that the opposition leader is taking all of this? I mean, for the last few weeks, he seems to have been the cock that was constantly crowing, without having to do a hell of a lot, because the Liberal Party kept on putting its own 2 feet in its collective mouths. They didn't make much sense. But anyway, I think you know what I mean. Yeah.
I wonder if part of the reason that Shorten has been walking around crowing is because he's got nothing else he can do.
Mm.
He's had ample opportunity to say something meaningful, and he hasn't managed it. For the Abbott government to have got a boost in the polls this week, after the gaffe after gaffe, after a near leadership spill that wasn't really resolved, it was just contained.
Mm.
Under these circumstances, it's essentially saying, look, this guy we got, at least we know what the gaffes are, and we know what the limitations are, and we know the fixation is on budget and security, and even if the majority of the population don't agree, at least they know what's likely to happen next. Whereas with Shorten, it's an absolute mystery what a Labor government under Bill Shorten would do next.
Is this saying something about the higher-ups within the Labor Party, or is this about Shorten's leadership style, would you say?
I think this is the fact that Shorten desperately wanted to be leader when no one else who's got a long-time future wanted it. And what we've essentially got is the leader you have when you don't want to risk losing the next election and tarring your name.
Mm.
So we have someone so desperate to be leader that, really, he's not ever going to be Prime Minister. They're in more need of a proper Prime Ministerial candidate than the Liberal Party are. At least we know what the Liberal Party leader delivers as Prime Minister. We have no sense of what anyone in the Labor Party would deliver as Prime Minister. So once again, we're leading up to an election, a federal election, that is more likely to be politics of punishment than we vote for you because we believe in you.
Mm.
We might punish the Abbott government out of power. We might not punish a Bishop or Turnbull government out of power, but we're unlikely to give government to a Shorten Labor government that hasn't persuaded anyone of anything.
I think that this is the reason why the Liberal Party managed to pull its head in, albeit temporarily, to galvanise around Tony Abbott, because the amount of damage done to the party by leadership speculation alone was quite enormous. And I think that many people in the public would have quite rightly protested with their feet and gone with the ALP in spite of Shorten's lack of policies, just to punish the Liberal Party for not having their house in order. After all said and done, this whole situation seems to me as though the Liberal Party, if they can't control their baser nature, will end up shooting itself in the head, and that's not a good situation for any political party to be in, especially if they happen to be in government.
Just a question quickly of the two of you. Do you think that the Liberal Party has learnt from the Labor Party's errors in the past where they've had that changeover of leader?
I think they're trying to. And that's why I think that they're trying to work out a way in which they can ease the Prime Minister out of office as opposed to execute him. They don't want the same sort of reputation that the Labor Party had during the Rudd kerfuffle. If they can avoid that, it'll save the party's reputation to a degree. I mean, look, behind closed doors, things get said, knives get plunged into people's backs, all kinds of things. But at least the public face has to be seen not to go down a really terrible path. The Labor Party's brand has been significantly damaged by the episode with Rudd Gillard. And I think it's going to take quite some time and a stronger political leadership, stronger than what it currently exists, to rectify itself and restitute its nature, its fundamental nature to its constituents, yeah?
I wonder if enough of the Liberal Party remember 2007, and they remember losing government not because Kevin Rudd offered a wonderful vision of the future, but because it was time for Howard and his cabinet to be punished. And now we have half of that cabinet still sitting in Parliament, and maybe they just remember enough to go, yeah, it wasn't that bad being kicked out after 11 years, but being kicked out after 3 would look really, really awful. So I don't think we're seeing any ability to learn. I think we're seeing that even egotistical, arrogant people can be shallow enough to not want to fall into obvious traps.
Also dominating the headlines this week is the aftermath of the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was gunned down after having dined with his girlfriend of 3 years, Anna Duritska, and Duritska recently fled Russia to be with her family in Kiev. So, who would have the motivation to order such a high-profile hit during such a sensitive time in Russian affairs? President Putin certainly has a fair share of domestic and international enemies.
Sure does. I tell you what, Putin has already got his people all over this, suggesting that there was some sort of external conspiracy to deliberately destabilize Putin's leadership over Russia. Is this possible under current circumstances? Absolutely. Politics is all based on conspiracy, and in certain parts of the world more so than in others, and in Russia probably more so again. I think that Putin has quite literally bitten off more than he can chew in terms of what's going on in the Ukraine and various other measures that the president has been trying to sort of stump up to the West and reignite the embers of the Cold War. And I think that there's a lot of people in the West who want to get back at Putin. Would they orchestrate some form of hit that would grievously destabilize the internal dynamic of Russia as a consequence of wanting to get back at Putin? Well, if the West thinks that it's the only way of doing it, quite possibly so.
I wonder if it's going back to very much a Stalin approach or a Stalinist approach to politics. There are enemies abroad, get people worried. There are enemies within, get them truly terrified. If this is a case, it's very convenient to get rid of Nemtsov and then blame it on the West and say there's fifth columnists. There's people within Russia that aren't good Russians. If people are so busy being paranoid about each other, you go back to the dark days of Stalinism where people spend more time working out how to knife or not knife each other than they spend actually analysing the world around them and realising they're being manipulated and abused. So whether it's Putin, whether it's some rogue Ukrainian, whether it's a rogue Chechen, it really doesn't matter who it is. The only person who benefits in the short term for this is Putin, because he will spin this better to the Russian people than anyone else could, and immaterial of what is said in the West, it's still Putin's perspective on this that will be absorbed and regurgitated across Russia.
He's the quintessential national security leader. And I would agree with you, Dave. I think that there is certainly that needs to be taken on board. But the interesting thing is Anna Duritska. Anna Duritska was with Nemtsov when he was killed, and now she's fled to Kiev. It's interesting. I mean, if they're going to if the Russian authorities want to have an investigation into Nemtsov's death, surely they need to have the key witness somewhere in the legal dock somewhere being interrogated by the Russian prosecutors or whatever. The fact of the matter is that Duritska now is in a country that has very, very bad relations with Russia. So would she volunteer her services to go back to Russia and give an account of what happened on that terrible night? It just seems a bit weird.
Yeah, you wonder, immaterial of who did the hit, how well organised they were. Like, why is there a witness alive?
Well, that's exactly right. Especially since, Russian politics, even during times of relative calm and stability, is usually a lot more brutal than anything the rest of the world has to offer. So, it is interesting that there was a survivor and then that survivor has fled. Now, it could very well be that Duritska has fled to the safety of her family. But as I say, the idea of actually investigating this murder becomes murkier as we go into the idea of trying to extradite Duritska back to Moscow to find out the full truth. Or if she does go back to Moscow, whether or not she's actually going to be alive long enough to deliver her version of events.
Well, it would seem necessary that if they can get her back to Moscow, that her security is maintained. Because if you drag people back from overseas and they're seen to disappear, that is returning to Stalinism. And Putin's too sophisticated for that. He might use the best of the toolkit, but I can't imagine him sinking to the worst. I really have to wonder with her fleeing back to Ukraine, if it is going to just be some lone individual that took the shot for very personal and micro-national reasons, that it is something like a Chechen or an individual Ukrainian going, what's this person doing? It's an opportunity to take out a high-profile target. If this is actually just, if we're experiencing, lone gunmen, lone wolves, why couldn't the Russians experience the same thing? Wanting to see a big conspiracy theory, wanting to see a Putin-esque plan, wanting to see a dastardly CIA plan. It's all really nice to have a conspiracy theory. But it's just as likely to be one person with a handgun.
Look, it's certainly possible. I'm curious to see how this is all going to unravel. And, now with this heightened degree of paranoia that the Russians are facing, and Putin in particular, if they do decide to, pull out a couple of the old tricks from Stalin's days, more sophisticated though they may be, what is going to happen to opposition movements within Russia itself? Are they going to be snuffed out? I mean, are we seeing now the start of a fascist/Stalinist kind of structure here?
Is this the start, or are we already into the consolidation phase? There doesn't seem to have been much meaningful commentary, opposition commentary out of Russia now for months. And what's left seems to be tolerated just so there's some. And it doesn't seem to be persuading a large chunk of the Russian population to get angry or to say, we want different politics, we want a different kind of life. If the polls are right that 86% of Russians broadly support Putin and his regime, because it's the only regime they can conceive of, the 14% probably need to keep their heads down. So whatever seems to be left of opposition in Russia doesn't seem an opposition that can transform it. And for all the noise that's been made in the Western press for the last 4 to 6 months, Russia's on the edge of something, some sort of political change, some sort of political uprising, people are getting motivated, people won't take it anymore. Really? The West was saying about this about the Russians multiple times in the 20th century, and every time they said it they were wrong. And the one time they didn't notice was when Gorbachev was freeing up the reins. So I really don't think we can use much Western analysis that is in the public sphere to genuinely gauge the Russian people or Russian perspectives on what kind of governance they want, because we've historically been consistently wrong.
Actually, it's interesting you should say that. There's an old spook that came out of MI5, about a week or so ago, and said exactly that, that the West has really taken its foot off the accelerator in terms of studying Russia as a geopolitical entity because, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, people thought, oh, well, that's it. Russia's now some sort of developing country. It's doing its own thing. We don't worry about it. Let's focus on other matters like, I don't know, Al-Qaeda, whatever. And that sort of Russian expertise, which was never really 100% at the best of times, literally collapsed, leaving us in a bigger hole in terms of what we know about Russia, what we know about what motivates Russians, and how Russians can constantly throw up these governance structures that are still autocratic in spite of the fact that the rest of the West thinks that it's Russia's turn to democratize.
It's a nice dream for us to think that Putin will fall over because the Russian people want him to fall over. We need a boogeyman, but we want to believe that our boogeyman won't be too frightening. Well, the reality is our boogeyman isn't what we think he is, and the population behind him aren't what we think they are either. As usual, we misunderstand Russia. I would really like to hear more from Brits who used to understand the Soviet Union, because they seem to be the most sophisticated analysis of Russia in English. I would like to read a lot more, German perspective on Russia, where they're far more involved in Russian economics than anyone else. They invest far more money, but so little of what they write is translated. So few people pay any attention to any conference in Germany about modern Russia. And yet, to me, this is where the insights are. What are the Hungarians saying after having Putin visit? Was that positive? Was it negative? Our pool of resources to do analysis on this is so woefully small, which is why little podcasts like us exist, so we can tell you there's not enough good information out there. If we could give you a fuller picture. Now would you like to consider all the big players out there that aren't giving you a good picture with an awful lot of supposed resources?
Well, anyway, that's a wrap for this week. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to your company again next week. Our thanks to producer Alicia Moraw and to David Olney. For now, goodbye from the Strategikon team.